Thanks everyone for joining our correspondence webinar today. We've got a fantastic panel who will introduce themselves in a minute, but welcome Natasha, Heather, Alistair and Lisa. We're discussing a topic that I think is really important at the moment and probably one that resonates with most people in financial services with everything that's going on around consumer duty. But specifically today, we're focusing on the issue of correspondence and some of the opportunities and challenges that consumer duty regulations are bringing in respect of how we communicate with customers going forward. We're going to cover some research that the Simplify team ran back at the end of last year that went directly to consumers and talked to them about their current experiences of receiving correspondence and how they interacted with their providers. So Tasha's going to take us through that, and then we'll have the perspective from each of our panelists today around their current experiences around correspondence and some of the challenges the industry is facing and what's happening to try and address some of those challenges, particularly with the consumer duty deadline looming. At the end, we've got an opportunity for some questions, so please feel free to ping those across to us and we'll direct those to the team. And then we'll close at about 1 o'clock. Great. So if we can start with some intros to start with. So Natasha, as you're top left in my screen, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. So I'm Natasha. I'm a wealth consultant here at Simplify. So I actually started my journey in financial services about 14 years ago. So started at Liverpool Victoria, and then I joined Simplify probably about a year and a half ago.
Thank you, Natasha. Alistair?
Sorry, find the unmute button. Hi everyone, I'm Alistair Walker. I'm Managing Director of a firm of chartered and certified financial planners in Leicestershire. Until a little bit earlier this year, I chaired the financial planning panel for the Personal Finance Society as well.
Brilliant, thanks Alistair. Lisa?
Hi, I'm Lisa Laybourne and I am Head of Technical and Regulatory Policy at TISA. I've been with TISA about 2 years, but I've worked in financial services for 30 plus years and for the last 16 or 17 in asset management. I spent a decade with a large TA, so I had a good view of the markets in general before moving to a regulated firm in an authorised person's role.
Great, thanks Lisa. Heather?
Good afternoon, everybody. So Heather Curtis, so I'm Customer Service Director for M&G Wealth. So that's a mixture of the platform and retirement account. I'm not going to say how long I've been in financial services. So a third of my career was spent in retail and private banking, and then the 2/3 have been spent in a mixture of the life, pension and platform market as well, and been with M&G for the last couple of years.
Perfect, thanks Heather. And I've left myself to last as I'm the least important person here, but Carl Woodward, Director and Founder at Simplify Consulting. We're a wealth consultancy with a team of practitioners who operate really solely in the wealth space, doing your traditional consultancy services, but hopefully bringing insight and capability to each of our engagements with our clients. Tasha, I wanted to start with you if that's okay. So I think I referred before to the research that we undertook at the end of last year, and some of the key bits of feedback that we took from that research that evidence really some of the challenges of correspondence and the way we communicate and providers communicate with customers today. What was some of the feedback and some of the lessons we learned from that piece of research?
Yeah, so so just I guess first of all, so the survey we did, it was a fairly sort of short, sharp survey, but we were really keen to get, I guess, some insight on consumers' behaviours with their financial communications. So we actually shared this with a lot of friends and family. So we tried to sort of steer away from sharing it with our sort of contacts and on the wider sort of audience within LinkedIn, because we didn't want to get too much of a biased view from those who have got experience. So was more focused on friends and family. So yeah, just a short survey, and I suppose we've got some key findings from that. So I'll just go through those now and sort of also draw out some of our conclusions, but feel free just to jump in as well with some of your thoughts, because it'd be interesting to hear what you're thinking too. So I guess the first part kind of focused on readership and engagement. So actually consumers and with their financial communications, how much of it are they actually reading? So perhaps these results aren't actually that surprising, but here we go anyway. So 15% of people said that they read all parts of their communications, which is quite low. And And then I guess the majority, so 38.5% of people said that they read parts that are key to them. And then we've got 30% of people who said they read very little, and 16.5% won't read them at all. So I guess we've got a small group of people there who are reading all parts, but then we've got quite a big group of people who I guess are weaving their way through their communications and trying to pull out what they think is relevant to them and what they think they need to know. And then you've got quite a big portion of customers who are reading little to none of their communications. So off the back of that, we also said, okay, if you're not reading your communications or reading all of it, what's the reasons for that? And we've pulled out top four reasons. So 65% of people said the length of their communications was off-putting, and 51% said they don't have the time. So I suppose those two probably go hand in hand, right? And then we've got 45% of people who feel there's too much technical jargon. And then we've also got 45% of people who said that there was no immediate or clear response required from them. So I suppose they're looking at this thinking, I don't know what I need to do, so won't bother reading it. So really interesting, but as I said, probably not surprising that there really is that lack of engagement there. And I suppose one of my initial thoughts was actually, what impact does that have to the consumer and to the outcomes that they're getting? Because I guess if they're not reading their communication, or they're reading parts of it which they interpret as being important, I suppose what impact is that going to have on their decision making? Could it lead to them making incorrect decisions, so in decisions not based on all of the information, or perhaps making no decision at all? And then obviously that can lead to the poor outcomes, can't it? So yeah, just be interesting to see what any of you sort of think further on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in there, Natasha. I mean, TISA undertook some commissioned Auxera to undertake some research as well last year, and we looked at stocks and shares ISAs because that's the kind of almost gateway or starting point for investment. We feel that's, you know, if a consumer is thinking about investing, that should be their start point. And you know, we wanted to know why consumers weren't engaging with stocks and shares ISAs and the communication issues around that. So, I mean, what we found, we looked at a sample of people who held a bank account and cash ISAs, and we found that 72% of them hadn't even considered a stocks and shares ISA. So, I mean, some of the main reasons is that they perceived the risks were higher than they actually were. Most people had said, you know, they don't want to risk losing money, even though if you kind of study mainstream investments over a decade, the likelihood of actually losing money is actually quite low. But interestingly, we saw as well that that 25% of people, rising to 34% actually with the women, said that you know, the language was too difficult to understand. So terms like diversification just wasn't kind of being understood. So I think, you know, there's a lot of terminology in the communications that are being used that actually kind of put people off of investment. And even if they hold investments, they're kind of, you know, what we found is that they're finding it difficult to wade through those terms, and it's causing them to kind of not engage with their communications properly. So, you know, I think that there's more that can be done. I briefly mentioned there the gender gap, and what we found as well, there is a gender gap in terms of engagement with the investment market, but there's also a geographical gap as well, with people living in London and surrounding counties more likely to engage in products like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Natasha, I was going to add that you've heard me say we've been doing consumer testing just now, and it's really interesting. It just very much reflects the conversations, and our testing was very much focused on more telephony conversations and experience, but it's exactly the same. And there's just that real lack of understanding as well. And even through a conversation, it doesn't really seem to make a difference whether it's written or, you know, or a conversation. And I did confess to you all earlier that one of my pension providers, a personal one, has written to me this morning, and I can honestly hand on heart say, I don't know what I meant to do with this letter. I don't know whether it's information or I'm being asked to do something, let alone when you start to really look at the language. You know, and obviously I've been in the industry a long time and worked for businesses who've tried to tackle language and how we explain things. And I really think it's time that we all need to stand up and really address that through consumer duty. And it's not about just chipping away at little bits and simplifying paragraphs or reducing letters or more infographics. It's actually about the language. It's things, you know, like crystallization, accumulation, decumulation. Do you really think that our generations through schools are going to understand that language? It's kind of Victorian, isn't it? Let's be honest. And, you know, at what point are we all going to make the shift to help everybody understand? And I think for me, that is one of the biggest challenges that we have now. And I do think it's doable, if everyone's on board.
I think that's a really interesting point, Heather. And I think we alluded to this, didn't we, Natasha, in our white paper that we produced, available on our website still, which was around who's writing the communications in the first place, and have we got the right people doing it? Because I think historically it's been probably a collective effort from obviously people in the industry, in businesses, but also with compliance and with legal being involved as well. Have we got actually the right groups of people helping to craft the messages we're trying to convey in a language that means something to the people that ultimately read them and don't share the same experience and knowledge that perhaps we think they might have? And is that changing? Maybe a question for you, Alistair.
Yeah, well, to weigh in with sort of my 20p on this, a couple of things came to mind. On one extreme, has anybody ever read the terms of service for a technology product that they've engaged with ever in history? In fact, famously, one had a prize if you clicked a link in the middle of page like 43 of 70 of their terms of service, and ended up actually someone did find it, click it, and then ended up trying to wriggle out of actually paying it. But I think it went to court, and the person that had clicked the link for the prize won. I think the regime that we have at the moment points to a systematic failure, effectively at every level. We have a regulator that felt that a regime of disclosure was required because people simply weren't behaving properly, and therefore, if you're obliged to disclose everything, the regulator thinks, well, problem solved. Then clients, customers, the end user will ultimately be informed. And then we have a compliance sector that interprets regulations and says, oh, actually, no, you don't just need to disclose everything. You need to disclose everything and then some more stuff. And so you have this like growing thing that goes, well, actually, yeah, maybe we should get legal involved, and they'll tell us to disclose even more. And then you end up with a completely untenable situation. I challenged one of our key sort of platform providers a little while ago on their documents. We had been obliged to produce and send 120 pages worth of initial disclosure documentation for somebody who was setting up some new products. It's absolutely nonsensical. You know, what and then basically the answer that the person who was senior in the organization, who I told, didn't believe me. So went away, came back and went, okay, I do believe you, and there's nothing we can do about it. Our compliance opinion is that this is all required. But what's the point in requiring it if it's never read? It's useless. So I'm hopeful that consumer duty will help, because it's a move away from a concept of disclosure to a concept of understanding.
Yeah,
that's a great segue, I think, into you, Lisa, and the kind of consumer duty and the work that you're leading from a TISA perspective at the moment. How's it going to hopefully reshape and change the way that correspondence is both designed, written, and understood by customers in the future?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as Alistair said, it's underpinned by that kind of concept of understanding, you know, firms need to consider all of the stages of the consumer journey, and how and when that information is communicated, the way that the content is laid out, the way that it's navigated, and the ability for consumers to kind of be coached and navigate their way through the choices that are available for them to make, and that kind of dovetails nicely with the consumer support outcome as well. You know, in addition to that, all considerations that firms make have to be inclusive of customer vulnerabilities to ensure that they are, you know, considered and addressed. But, you know, I mean, it's funny, you know, we're talking about disclosures there, and there was a disclosures framework consultation last month, and TISA favours kind of a one simplified document over and above all of these documents that we've got going on at the moment, because it almost goes against the grain, you know, what we have at the moment almost goes against the grain of consumer duty, because the FCA very clearly set out 5 points to consider actually where they, you know, where firms are attempting to communicate effectively with clients. So firstly, we should be thinking about layering the information. So it's that technique that we use to support customers making their effective decisions by highlighting the key information, so it's easy to identify, highlighting where they need to make decisions and act, cross-referencing with links to further information if need be, rather than kind of presenting it all in that sort of 120 page novel mentioned there. And you know, it should also be, the information needs to be relevant as well, so it needs to be relevant to that point in the consumer journey. We've spoken about simplified language, so we should be attempting to use plain language that is understandable to consumers, but we have all of these you know, regulatory requirements sitting there to use certain types of language, to use certain risk warnings that may not be kind of the best approach when we look at sort of behavioural science and what we know about the threshold of understanding in the context of the target market, and in the context of underpinning legislation like the Consumer Act and like the Mental Capacity Act as well. And finally, it's the timing of the communications as well. We don't want to kind of, you know, we shouldn't be looking to throw the kitchen sink at it right at the start of the consumer journey. We should be thinking about the timing of when and what we want to communicate to consumers, and what we expect them to do with that information. So are we expecting them to act upon it? And communications where a client is expected to act should be prioritised in your review of consumer duty as well, because that is where we have the basic harm.
Really useful, Lisa. And given your look across the industry, how well do you think providers are kind of stepping up to the challenge that consumer duty is prompting, and how well are they doing that in the context of a looming deadline?
I mean, I think that all firms that I have engaged with are highly engaged in consumer duty. We're working very hard to achieve the deadline, but I think we have to acknowledge that they may not entirely get there by the 31st of July. And I think that the FCA know this as well. You know, I was speaking to a large transfer agency last week, and there are thousands of templates to review. So this is, you know, it's a short time frame. I know it was extended, but it's a short time frame. So prioritisation is the key here. And the FCA stated that they held a webinar in January, and they acknowledge that there's a lot to do, but prioritisation should be really the key to think about where there is potentially the greatest harm could occur. And prioritise those communications for review to ensure that we mitigate all reasonably mitigate all harm.
Definitely, a huge amount of work. I think this brings us nicely onto you, Alistair. So we're delighted you're here. You attended the Next Wealth event in London a few weeks ago and gave a very eloquent talk about the journey you've been on as an organisation, as a business, in terms of trying to already simplify your financial planning reports. And I guess there's a evolution of that will continue, particularly with consumer duty in mind. But I wonder if you didn't mind just sharing that journey that you've been on so far, what that now looks like going forwards.
Yeah, definitely. The challenge I think that we all face as parts of the sector is trying to do what we think we need to do, but also what our clients want us to do. And I'm lucky from running a small business. I can make changes and see how they go. And 5 years ago, a bit longer ago now actually, we made some big changes to how we worked on an ongoing basis, and we started producing more, I'd call, bespoke financial planning for clients. really focused on their financial futures, their objectives, their outcomes. And by the way, I'd say probably deals with 80% of the compliance of a financial planning business. If you really know your clients well and you focus on their outcomes, you kind of don't have to worry nearly so much about box ticking at the other end. As I say, I think the box ticking issues represent a sort of systematic failure, sort of fundamentally. But in doing that, our annual reporting just expanded and expanded and expanded. And a moment came a year ago where I realised we were sending very typically 15 pages of prose to a client each year. And this is in addition to all of the provider-related content. So this was all about their financial planning, a bit about their investments, all about them. And it was a challenge actually from a consultant, Brett Davidson, who you may know. And his challenge was that in his experience, having worked with clients and spoken to lots of advisors that work with clients, the high point of a relationship with a client is the moment they walk out of your meeting room, and anything you do to follow up actively reduces that feeling. You know, so you're working against the high point of a relationship when you're following up from an annual review meeting. That was a perspective I hadn't considered before, and I think I probably immediately disagreed with it, and then reflected over the next few weeks and sort of begrudgingly came around to the idea. So I started asking clients, and that was the most important change, was actually going, well, okay, we're doing what we think clients want. What do they actually want? So I sort of picked a group, a friendly group to begin with, and then I kind of spread out as I went along. So I thought the people who are going to be most open and most talkative to me about this. And universally, the message was, we don't read your reports. It was, we trust you. We know that you're doing the right job for us. We love the stuff that we talk about in the meeting, and the follow-up, we assume, just tells us all the things you've already talked to us about. It wasn't completely universal. I have a couple of very detail-oriented clients who enjoy reading the reports, but even they said they skip whole sections because it's the same every year or whatever else. So through that process, I decided that radical change was basically the only option. And we now follow what amounts to a 5-page financial planning report. The first is a handwritten letter by the, well, not quite handwritten, but personally written letter by a financial planner. We've then got an objective focus page that just goes, where are you in terms of being on track for your objectives? Followed by a page of all the planning needs, the bits that we worry about, so the clients don't have to. And it is as simple as it can possibly be. It is a table with red, amber, green ranking of sort of where they are in terms of being on track. One page on the sort of product investment piece. I have a section that I ultimately called important notes, but I really wanted to call the boring compliance stuff, but ultimately I was told I wasn't allowed to do that. So and it is the shortest part of the whole thing, very deliberately. And then an action plan, and this speaks to, I think, some of the research that's come back. The last page, I wanted something that clients could stick on the fridge if they wanted to. These are the things I have to do as the result of the financial planning meeting I had this year. And tick off the actions as they went down the list. So those were the outcomes, if you like. There were some things that I really didn't think I'd have to lose, but ultimately did. I'm a massive fan of cash flow planning, big proponent of it. I think every financial advisor should be using it extensively. But I learned begrudgingly that clients aren't that interested in seeing the charts following from the meetings. I thought clients are going to love to see all these lovely cash flow charts. It's going to look great. And again, the feedback was in the meeting when we're talking it through, it makes absolute sense to us. You give it to us cold a couple of weeks later in a letter, and we're just going, right, those are just pictures. So I had to do that. So that was killing my sacred cow, I think I called it in the talk I did at Next Wealth. So yeah, feedback's vital. This is what we learned from the experience, or I learned from the experience. Feedback's vital. I reckon less than 5% of clients read more than 50% of the stuff that we send them. I have pretty much made that up, but it feels intuitively right. And I think that the big mistake that I'd made when I looked at this before was starting with what we've got and working out what to cut away. Because you just can't. You've got to start with a blank sheet and say, in an ideal world, what is the minimum I could say to convey what I need to convey for this document. And it was only by doing that I found we were able to significantly change what we were doing.
And following what you've done, is the feedback from clients that it's now far more appropriate, it's proportionate, it's tailored, it's, the language is better, the charts aren't important, et cetera, et cetera. Is that the feedback you've had that's continuing to take you on that journey?
Yeah, definitely. And this is also something. It's not going to look like this in 5 years. At the moment, what we've got is still a document. It's still something effectively generally gets PDF'd and shared on a portal. I think there's scope in there for it to be much more multimedia. I think there's a whole swathe of people that just don't communicate that well through the written word. And almost all of what we do is actually communicative face to face one way or another, and then we follow it up with something that's completely different in terms of communication style. So that's a direction that I'd like to take us in, and again that I think would be very useful for. But again, the danger is you go, well, video is the future, so every client needs video, and of course there are people who just won't watch them, and so it's not enough just to go broad brush, this is it. And that's, I guess, what Consumer Duty is pushing for, right? It is going, identify what your clients need, preferably by asking them, and then deliver to those groups of clients that need those things in a certain way.
Really useful context, Alistair. And I guess, Heather, you're kind of the antithesis in terms of the size of the business that Alistair is. So you have another set of challenges that you're trying to address, not only with all the stakeholders you have to keep happy, and obviously the customers as well, but how you approach that change on a much larger scale.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting hearing, from an advisor perspective through Alistair. And I think the thing that jumps out for me the most is, I guess, the deluge of correspondence that the provider then issues. Now, really, a platform should almost be that silent in the background. We just make it work. But the reality is, we've got T&Cs that land with Alistairs of the world, and also with end customers as well. And I think we're going to have to be really, really careful that we don't end up just doubling up. Yeah. And Alistair and I spoke briefly about almost that stepping on advisors' toes. Where is the line, right? We all ultimately want to make sure the end customer understands and is protected. Yeah. And really focus on, fair value, preventing harm, all of that lovely language we're all using through Consumer Duty. Basics are we've got to protect our customers as well, don't we? But that does not mean doubling up on every type of correspondence possible. And I'm a real believer in that, no matter what we do, we're all moving to digital, which is fantastic, but we still have customers at retirement age who don't want to do that, right? Even the most tech savvy want to talk to someone. Yeah. And that's when we get into vulnerability, obviously, as well. So I think it's been, it's back to that, really talking to customers about what they need. But I do think there's going to have to be better collaboration between any of the platforms, the M&Gs of the world, with advisors as well, so that we look at how we're both hitting the same customer with this huge amount of information. And Carol, I think I mentioned to you in the past, I worked for a protection provider when it launched. Some of you might have heard of Bright Grey. So that was about 20 years ago. And when we launched the business, there was a huge focus on not following the traditional way of corresponding. So, for example, the paper was white on one side, pink on the other. So it made it really easy for advisors, customers, GP surgeries to see it. So we got a really positive reaction from that. And we spent a lot of time focusing on how to set out the correspondence. So very clearly, what is it we're telling you? What are we asking you to do? But it was interesting, there was quite a backlash in the early days of that, because people are way more comfortable with traditional language. And that included compliance, legal, etc. And it was a fascinating reaction. But I do think we do have to give this a good poke and simply, it's about keep it simple, protect people, but do keep it simple. And that word Alistair uses regularly, this understand, totally agree with it. And, if you look at some rules and regulations in the past, simple things that affected us all, like remember the direct debit guarantee? Yeah. And I remember managing call centers where you had to read out this huge document. Yeah. And customers had to say, I understand at the end. It's still there, isn't it? Right.
It is.
See it for withdrawals, for small pots and all of that stuff. And that is something that we're really, really tackling now, because it's quite embarrassing, quite frankly. It's uncomfortable. That could be my mum. It could be me. Do you know what I mean? Having to make that phone call. So I think for the platform, we have got quite a bit of responsibility here, or any pension provider, to step up and work with advisors and understand the end customer experience to really drive that change and work with the regulator. I'm seeing, we're quite lucky, I've got some really good customer focused compliance experts in the business who are really stepping up just now and saying, COBS rules, you've probably taken that just too far from a customer perspective. But people do work with blinkers, don't they? And as I've got to make sure, hit that rule, tick that box. And I think that's where consumer duty for me has been fabulous. And I know we've got our deadline to work with in July, but for me, this is a DNA thing. Consumer duty shouldn't be a project. This is the way we should be constantly challenging every change we make, every new product, every review of T's and C's and documents. This is going to be an ongoing moving feast. But we've got to challenge ourselves to be better and simpler and clearer, for our customers. So certainly for us on the platform, I found consumer duty quite useful actually, and really pushing that end customer experience, and and it goes hand in hand with improvements we want to make internally as well, I think. But times have changed, and we've really got to step up to the plate, is my view.
Go on, Heather. Go on, Sasha, jump in.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's something you just touched on, Heather and Alistair, as well, was just about communication channels. So in our survey, we asked people sort of, how do you receive the majority of your communications? How would you prefer to receive them? So I think 45% of people said that they preferred email. We had 28% of people who said they prefer online or via an app. And then we still had 24% of people who want post. But then we looked into that and said, okay, compared to how you're receiving your communications and how you'd prefer to, what does that look like? And I think it was 44%. So less than half of people receive their communications in the way that they want to. So that just sort of shows you actually there's a disconnect there, isn't there, for understanding what consumers want and how they want to receive the communications. And that must be really important as well to getting to that level of engagement and readership too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the one thing certainly, sorry Tasha, just to continue from sort of the platform perspective, one area that we're really focusing on is non-advised customers. Okay, we are an advised proposition, but we do have non-advised customers, and that can be for multiple reasons. Their advisors gone out of business, and we can refer people to, all the other bodies that we should. But the reality is they want to talk to someone, and that ultimately ends up with my customer-facing teams. And it can be so difficult because they just don't know what to do. We have a lot of vulnerability in there as well, and you can imagine the correspondence landing with them. They just want to talk to someone, and we're really looking closely at that and what we can do to make that the best experience in that non-advised world. But I think the vulnerability piece for me is that's absolutely massive and a huge area of focus. It's not as simple as putting flags on people's accounts. It's not that clinical way. It's actually about the conversation of what you do. So I think providers, that's huge, and especially where there's a power of attorney and working with the holder of the POA so they understand, and the advisor. And we're finding ourselves increasingly getting into these conversations where there's 3 or 4 parties, and we have to take the time. At the end of the day, we've got people with a huge amount of money invested in quite difficult circumstances. So I'm definitely seeing more of a trend into that space, and it's difficult. Yeah,
and I think that's a real area of interest for you, Lisa, isn't it? Vulnerabilities in customers, and I guess this is going to be a real focus for how providers, advisors communicate and understand their needs in a different way in the future to perhaps how it's been historically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think vulnerability is a spectrum, and our understanding around vulnerability and how it can arise, the transient nature of it has, it's evolved even since 2020 when the FCA issued their vulnerability guidance, and it's no longer enough actually just to think about have you tick the box that you're offering communications in Braille or for people with audio challenges. And there also is a lot of focus, especially in the banking community, around financial vulnerability. But there are a whole range of different vulnerabilities that people need to click onto. And I think a lot of it is around actually listening and communicating with the customer, because you be able to pick up some cues, I think, and it's about training the staff to do that, and developing professional empathy. And professional empathy is difficult. It's not sympathy, but it's kind of recognising those cues that the customer is trying to tell you, and very often those are not picked up. They would be trying to tell you something. So I think that communications need to be tailored according to characteristics of the target market, of course, but it also should be thought about on an individual level. But we also should be thinking about sort of the complexity of the product, the communication channel used itself as well, and how suitable that is. Does it need follow-up? So if you're issuing a communication by post, for example, or by email, and you think that, as Heather said, someone will want to speak to you about that, you should, put a telephone up where they can contact the firm in a very kind of obvious place. So I'll give you an example actually of, and it's not in the financial sector, it actually comes from the media sector. I hate actually receiving phone calls from.
We've just lost you, Lisa. Your mic's gone.
Are you back? Am I back?
You're back now. That's right.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, I was just going to give you an example actually, coming from media communications, so broadband and television. I actually always untick being telephone because they always get me at the wrong moment, and they persist in doing it. And actually, I had phone call there trying to tell me some quite important financial information about my account, so that the charges were going up with RPI, and they wanted me to lock into a different deal. And I just couldn't take it in at that moment. I was doing other things. They still persisted. And actually, if they'd have just written to me or emailed me, I could have just taken that information in at that point. So it's about kind of what are you trying to communicate and when, and thinking about offering those different communication channels. And communicating to retail customers in a way, of course, we shouldn't forget, clear, fair and not misleading is still very relevant in providing that information to customers on an accurate and relevant and timely basis. But it's also, one thing that we've kind of not touched on here yet is that customers are also, it's accepted by the regulator that customers are also still expected to take some responsibility for the decisions they make when they're purchasing and using financial products. Obviously that varies depending on whether they are being advised or execution only, and a firm will need to decide what the materiality of their influence on the final outcome for the customer is. But they can take responsibility, but only where a firm's communication will enable them to understand those products and services, and the features and the risks and the implications that of the decisions that the customer will make. So, I mean, the clear, fair, leading and misleading requirements remain there. Consumer duty rules adds that additional layer, I think, ultimately protecting the customers by addressing that asymmetry of information between what the information that the firm is trying to communicate and the way that it's received by the customer. And of course, there's the evidencing piece as well. So it's very, very challenging for firms to be able to evidence all of this. And some ways of evidence, it's been touched on here again, is sort of testing in advance of issuing communications, and of course on an ongoing basis to make sure that customers are being given the right information in the right format at the right time. And before I finish, I just wanted to mention as well, there's lots of information actually available to help firms out there. I should mention the Tiger Best Practice Guide, of course, but I also wanted to read a document that was issued by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy that was commissioned by the Behavioural Insights team, and that's produced a best practice guide that is looking at presenting contractual terms. And it contains some really good and useful techniques to increasing consumer engagement with important information that you're trying to sort of give to.
Thanks, Lisa. Alistair, from your point of view, I guess a lot of your interactions are face-to-face with clients. And so you start to understand and get that kind of human interaction around potential vulnerabilities and how you might engage with them on a one-to-one basis that's tailored and specific to that individual. Do you take that into account in terms of how you correspond with them? Are you starting to think about more tailored approaches rather than a one-size-fits-all?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting hearing the discussion so far and thinking about vulnerability, but also about preference. And I think preferences change, and respecting that's important too. So one thing that I'd observe is that our printing and posting bill fell by 90% through 2020, 2021. Now, at the same time, funnily enough, our meeting rooms went unused in that time as well, for the most part. What's happened since then is that the meeting rooms have almost completely come back to the levels they were. We're about 80% face-to-face meetings now, 20% Zoom, whereas through the pandemic, we were, more than the opposite. But the printing and posting bill hasn't come back up because client preferences have changed. So not only have we changed our default, and I'm a big believer in sort of default planning and that sort of Kasten-Sunstein nudge concept of defaults are important, and what you say as a default will affect people's preferences, but also that preferences have changed out of necessity through COVID, but also communication expectations have changed a lot. So I think we still do print and post some stuff to people that want it, but our default assumption is that people don't want it. And that hasn't been pushed back on in any meaningful way. I'm a stickler for language use, and so we try not to use the word vulnerable customer, because to call somebody vulnerable is a character judgment, right? You're going, this is a factor about you. You are vulnerable. I think it was the Vulnerability Task Force came up with this concept of clients in vulnerable circumstances. So that's the language we try and use. It's a time of their life or an event that's happened that is causing vulnerability. And so it's no longer a judgment of their character, but a sort of a comment on their situation. And we think we've got a good handle on it, but we try and challenge ourselves. So one thing we've done, we've appointed someone in the office who's not on the sort of on the management team, but they have strong views on this and good background in other sectors. They're the vulnerability champion of the business, and they have the mandate to challenge us planners, to challenge us as a management team on whether we're doing this right, and we've got some real measurable outcomes from that. The other thing that we implemented, which had a surprisingly big impact, was, again, we think we do quite well. Life event is an area of vulnerable circumstances that I think we all understand. But there's this issue of we've got this kind of experience, resilience, capability concept that we implemented as a result of a review of sort of vulnerability and how we deal with it. So we're challenging ourselves with every client each year to just confirm on a scale of 1 to 5, and it's completely subjective, but to force ourselves to put a sort of in our mind number on the client in front of us is experience, scale of 1 to 5, resilience, financially, scale of 1 to 5, and capability, 1 to 5. And then require ourselves to take action if the sum of those numbers is smaller than a certain level. And of course, that can be varied. And what it's done is it's highlighted areas where otherwise we wouldn't have picked up on circumstances that lead a client to be vulnerable. Is that classic thing of you start measuring something and you start to learn something from those measurements. So that's been a small change. It doesn't take a long time. It's not onerous, but it's really challenged us to think about relationships we already have with vulnerability. And I think that continuous challenge is really important certainly from my perspective, dealing with clients directly.
That's really interesting, and that's kind of starting to use feedback and data to then inform how you essentially shape some of the things you do differently in the future. I guess, Heather, one for you before we jump onto the questions. We've had quite a few. It's just around kind of data analytics and kind of tech enablers to helping you reshape and reform and transform how you kind of manage correspondence in the future, and how you start, because you must be capturing so much data about your customers all the time and life events and interactions you have with them. How is that starting to shape your kind of correspondence strategy?
Yeah, so we are lucky we've got a number of tools. So apart from the consumer testing, which you can't beat face-to-face, close sessions with consumers, that we do have quite sophisticated technology to analyse conversations with customers or with advisors. So we're using that to really pick out what are the themes, why do people feel they have to phone us, what don't they understand, what's not clear, what are we, are we just driving people, just demand into the business constantly by how we behave as well. So I think that's really been interesting, and we have a big focus now on root cause of everything, right? So why do advisors and customers have to take time out of their lives to phone us to ask a question based on something we've sent them or asked them to do? That's wrong, right? It should be really, really simple. It should be as digital as possible. But that's been really interesting, and you can very clearly start to see the themes. So we've actually restructured a lot of our customer service and operational areas. So we very much focus on what we call customer journeys, right? So we've not got people spread over everything, but people who are experts in whether it's money inside of things, general servicing and the money outside of things. And then amongst that, similar to Alistair, we've got the customer champions who deal when there's a vulnerable customer situation. But you can see from all of those routes, plus your traditional surveys, you have the customers, that's NPS or advisor surveys, you can see it all starting to tie in. And there are big arrows, there's big red flags to do that. And I can see certainly in M&G, we're driving that real change in how we react and how we focus and how we drive change. Yeah, it's not just change that M&G wants to make, it's got to have a huge customer or end customer angle or an advisor angle as well, so that we get the right outcomes. But you're right, I think the technology side, and obviously you've got your analytics for online, you can see where people are having to check how-to guides. So why is it not clear enough to be able to click a few buttons, and people are having to check that? So that's fascinating. And again, to what I said earlier, we've got this July deadline, but this is ongoing. And as Alistair said, we can see a huge change in consumer behaviour. We can see a change in advisor behaviour. We ran surveys on advisors, and a certain age group want to phone, and we've got a certain age group would want to do online chat. And some just don't want any written correspondence. You can really see it. And we've got to just keep that going, I think, and keep shaping and reacting and building. That's the right thing to do. And I think that point on, customers then, vulnerability, I think I've got two concerns. One is that we have a group of customers who don't fall into that category, but are not interested, don't really care, don't have the time, feel embarrassed to talk about it. That's a strong one coming through. My husband's probably one of those, perfectly intelligent man, but just to think, well, I've got an advisor, but I'm not really that interested. And then the reality is, when it comes to a situation with a customer, and I've got one at the moment, the reality is you have just got to be so pragmatic about it. There is no legal compliance, there's no rule book anywhere that's going to help you when you have a customer in tears on the phone, right? Or sitting with a bit of correspondence we've sent saying, I don't have a clue, right? And what we've had to do is be really agile, and I don't care what your job title is, I'm straight on to a call with somebody from compliance, some of our managers, to see what can we best do in this situation, because there isn't a rule book for it. And that's what you have to do. We have thousands of customers, but I'm afraid that's the reality.
Yeah. Really interesting. I wanted to just cover some questions as we've got 10 minutes left, if that's okay. Lisa, I'll point this one at you, not a bad place to start. This is from Dan. I gather the FCA consumer duty deadline is 31st of July. What exactly must be achieved by FCA regulated firms by this point?
So, I mean, firms need to comply with the duty. So that is the FCA's start point. But there is, I briefly touched on earlier that there is this kind of, I think, acceptance that it, as Heather has said, this is a journey that firms need to continue on. Culture is right at the heart of how the FCA regulates firms and supervises firms. So I think demonstrating that kind of cultural change, ensuring that any kind of reasonably foreseeable harm has been identified and prioritised is really the key to kind of demonstrating that consumer duty has been taken seriously. I think I couldn't sit here now and say, well, I mean, I don't know the nature of the business that I'm giving the answer to, that you need to, tick the box of this, and this. But each firm will need to decide where their most areas of potential and foreseeable harm are, and what that actually looks like. So my suggestion would be on a practical note is to ensure that you've mapped out that consumer journey at a very detailed level. At each point of the consumer journey, look at what the communication and touch points look like, define any potential foreseeable harms at those touch points, and ensure that you've demonstrated that you've acted upon that. You know, you've taken steps to mitigate the risk of any harms.
Great, thanks, Lisa. A question for you, Tasha, from Kate. What was the biggest surprise from the research?
I'm not sure if it was a surprise or just more interesting. I think it was probably just that split between around engagement and readership. I think, as we probably all know from our own personal experiences, I think we probably know that we're not fully engaged with our financial communications. Well, I know I'm not. I'll get some things through and think, oh, I think that's about that, but I don't need to read it, and just put it to one side. But I think it's just that 15% of people who are reading all of their communications, that's so low. That's such a low pool of people. There's so many people who are just kind of disregarding it or just trying to skim over it. I think that's probably, yeah, it's probably not a surprise really, but I just think it's really interesting, and it's just actually what's the impact of that lack of engagement and readership. I think you could draw so many conclusions from that, but yeah, I think when you start thinking about it more, I guess that's when it becomes a bit more of a surprise in your mind, and you start thinking about all of the different impacts and what that could lead to. Then you think, oh, that's actually a real problem.
And I guess one of the tests, the success of Consumer Duty in a sense, is doing that research in a year's time and seeing if some of those numbers are actually shifting and there's a change, and whether people really understand that there has been a transformation in the industry that perhaps they're not aware of. They won't have heard of Consumer Duty, they won't be aware of it. But is it manifesting itself and actually people interacting more and being more engaged when they receive correspondence?
Yeah, definitely.
Heather, one for you. Correspondence is often driven by ops with heavy influence on risk and compliance. Do you think there needs to be a shift in capability and approach in the risk and compliance space to improve consumer engagement with communications and therefore resulting outcomes?
The short answer is yes. And I think that links to what Lisa was talking about. There's a whole culture piece here, right? And, you know, it's got to come from within. We've got to have colleagues, I don't care what your role is, who know why they're here. We're all here for the end customer. And really understand the impact of their behaviour, and just to think differently and be aware of the changes in society, all the different generations as well. And I think I said at the start of this call, we've been really lucky with one particular compliance consultant that's working with us, and she is really challenging initial or legacy interpretation of certain rules, put it that way, and really standing up and saying, no, she's got her consumer duty hat on and saying, no, we need to be looking at it this way. And it's almost that keeping the customer safe, keeping us safe, but really starting to push things. But that does go back to culture as well, yeah? And so I think these two things definitely work hand in hand for me, but you're right, traditionally it's led by legal compliance and ops, a little bit wrapped around it with marketing to make it all seem nice. We've got to move away from that. Keep it short and simple and direct. And to your point, the testing and then using the technology we have to analyze conversations and keep that, not just wait for the results of consumer testing or surveys, but keep that going. And you can tell by the calls coming into your business, the complaints and all of that, you can start to see the trends there quite easily. But the trick is you've got to be on this all the time.
Yeah.
Which is the point about it moves into your DNA, not a project.
Yes, that's a perfect segue. We did have another follow-up question, which was, as a follow-on, it sounds like this is the start of an iterative journey to improve customer comms. Is that a fair point? And I think you probably just answered that one, Heather.
Totally. You know, we'll get it to a point, but there's absolutely no way you'll leave it. And I think, Lisa, you talked about the deep dives into customer journeys and mapping it all. We've done all of that. And we've got a list of priorities, but we've also got a list of other things. A lot come from our colleagues, you know, as well, saying that just doesn't feel right. So we need to do that next. It doesn't mean we don't meet the requirements, but it's us, again, part of the culture, taking responsibility and saying that's not good enough, right? We can be better. Yeah, that's work. You know, we're working with advisors like Alistair as well and getting their view when it's the intermediated part of the business is really most interesting for me.
Yeah. A question for you, Alistair. Do you think consumers need to take more responsibility and accountability themselves in understanding what they're investing in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that I don't think it's a big problem. Basically, I don't think that there is a lack of taking of responsibility per se. But I think it would be easier if we acknowledged quite how opaque the financial services world is to people. I think Heather mentioned the word decumulation right at the start as one of an example, right? That isn't just jargon, that's a completely made up word. And I didn't even realize it was a completely made up word until I started arguing with Word Spell Checker about whether it was a dictionary word or not. And then I went down a little rabbit hole and found out it's not. We've just completely made it up. That's beyond jargon. That's a fabricated word. And so when we're dealing with that level of kind of nonsense to any normal or reasonable person, we have to consider that it's hard where to draw that responsibility line. So I think we could get a lot better at recognizing quite how complex things are, but also that people are quite good at educating themselves if they're suitably motivated. So there's like a motivation aspect to it as well. And there is a little bit of an inclination, I think, to go, well, look, we've given them everything. How could they possibly not have worked this out? And you've got this 110-page tome. Whereas, there are some really good examples of particularly sort of good modern direct-to-consumer offerings that do a good guided tour type talk about what risk is, about what the products do, how tax treatment is. Some of the robos are doing really, really good and sensible stuff there that I think the rest of the world, intermediated and non-intermediated, could learn from.
Definitely. Very quickly, last one for you, Lisa. Just in terms of Nina, we mentioned video earlier being one method, one channel that companies might start using. Are you seeing any others being explored across the industry as a means of communicating to customers in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's all sorts of different channels of communications at the moment. So, I mean, video, as we spoke about, probably more on the advisory side, but we're seeing the sort of chat boxes, etc. And kind of also we're looking as well at the sort of robo advice type part of it. TISA is exploring some work. It's been actually working with the FCA and the government around the advice guidance boundary as well. So that's another area where we feel that Consumer Duty could be kind of in conflict with the existing guidance. Actually, PERGI is actually guidance on advice guidance boundaries. Firms could be offering more in terms of robo advice and nudges, etc. To offer a more personalized journey, so without kind of dipping into advice, but kind of more personalizing that guidance that's made. So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see this evolve, and as Heather has said, we need to kind of use those those behaviours of consumers and take those to inform what we do going forward.
Brilliant. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but that's been really interesting, and the hour's absolutely flown by. I'd like to thank my panellists, Natasha, Heather, Alistair, Lisa. Thanks ever so much for all your inputs and contributions. It's been really insightful and interesting. Thanks to everyone that attended and asked a question. And we hope to see you again on a future webinar soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks for hosting. Thank you.
Bye.